My name is Jean, and I'm going to talk to you about when my husband Max and I decided to leave London and spend 6 months sailing with our two young children, Guy and Hugh. Here's the crew: Max, me, Guy, who was 3.5, and Hugh, who was just 18 months. The decision was made in October 1989, and we set sail 6 months later. During those months, we made the boat suitable for long-distance sailing, rented out our house, and explained to our families what we were doing. The netting in the photos surrounding the deck was pretty good at saving toy cars and Lego. If the boys left the cockpit, they'd be wearing either a harness or a life jacket. Batusa Donna was a wonderful family cruising boat. She wasn't the fastest boat on the water, and by the time we'd loaded up with books, toys and other sailing equipment, she was a bit lower and slower, but we had no complaints. The accommodation was limited. I don't know exactly how many square metres we had, but I think it was about 15 inside. Not much of this was floor space, but we did have everything we needed. The galley was just big enough for one person. If it was rough, I had a special strap to stop me falling backwards. There was a small oven and 2 gas burners. No fridge, although we occasionally bought ice from fishermen and enjoyed the luxury of a cold drink. Storage of everything was behind the seating cushions, under the bunks and under the floorboards. All tinned food was carefully labelled with water-resistant markers, so that if the paper labels washed off, we could still tell the difference between a tin of pasta and a tin of fruit salad. We had 2 loos, each with a basin. We also had a shower, but since we didn't carry very much fresh water, this was only used in harbours. Water was always rationed. It was only used for cleaning teeth, half a cup per person, cooking vegetables, and drinking water. We washed up in seawater, swimming took care of us, and I washed my very long hair in seawater as well. We did fine. The deck was our garden and the play area for the boys, but we had to be careful walking around in bare feet, otherwise we'd stub our toes. 3 months into our 6-month trip, we knew it would be longer. By chance, the tenants had asked if they could extend the lease on the house, and that made the decision final. The trip would be open-ended. As a result, we were able to go further. Here you can see the first half of the trip was spent in the Mediterranean, the blue map. From there we sailed down to the Canary Islands and across the Atlantic, the green map. Although he'd stopped before I was born, my father also had a love of the sea and had spent many years sailing and racing his ketch Nordwind. He wasn't exactly thrilled when we left, but he did understand. Max and I became well used to night sails. In many ways it was easier for us to sail overnight as the boys were asleep and we could take it in turns the next day to look after them while the others slept off the sleep deprivation. The watch between 3 and 6 a.m. is often called the dog watch, and with good reason. The body and mind is at its most tired and it's very hard to keep awake. But in the Mediterranean, it's important to keep alert. There's a lot of cargo being shipped around, and those ships don't stop at night. Any sailor is aware that a small sailing boat is just a tiny blip on the radar of a big ship, and it's the sailing boat who has to give way, and in good time. It was my turn to take the dog watch. It was a calm night, no wind, and the boat was heading along under the engine with just the mainsail up for stability. We had an automatic steering system when we were under power. It wasn't perfect, but it meant you could make a cup of coffee or check the chart. Suddenly I spotted a white light, very low on the horizon. I wasn't worried. A white light is the stern of a ship or boat, and therefore we weren't on a collision course, but I did note it in the logbook. The next time I looked, the light was still dead ahead, but a little higher. Okay, we were catching up with it. Chances are it was a sailing boat a little smaller than ours, not a problem. But then a few minutes later I looked again, and this light was alarmingly high. Suddenly I was really worried. Whatever it was approaching fast and it was dead ahead. I did have to make a decision. I went down to the cabin and turned on our radar. I couldn't do this too often because it interfered with the steering system and we started going in circles, but I decided to risk it. There was nothing on the radar at all. Was I imagining things? I went back to the cockpit and the light was higher still. By now it was about 4:30 a.m. and still dark. I could see no other lights, but whatever this was, it was huge. I turned the boat to port and carried on. I still couldn't see anything. And then slowly night was changing to day. The light was still there, but underneath it was sky. Venus was shining down on us and gradually fading as it became lighter. Of course, I felt a right fool. It was noted in the logbook, but we didn't really talk about it. I mean, Venus? For goodness sake. But some years later, with a twinkle in his eye, my father asked me if I had ever taken action to avoid hitting a planet. I realised he must have done the same thing, and I felt vindicated. Before we left England, I'd visited a doctor who was well known in the sailing community. He was also a sailor, and for a small fee plus the price of any items, he'd prepare a tailor-made first aid kit for people preparing a long journey. After handing me 3 enormous boxes of bandages, suturing needles and thread, and medication suitable for both adults and children, he told me not to forget to visit a dentist before we left. I have very good teeth. Max has disastrous teeth. So I went to see the dentist, who knew all about both of us. He made up a package, including tools and filler for cavities. Both he and the doctor said that they hoped the investment would all be thrown away unused. The Mediterranean is full of islands, and we spent a very happy few days in the Balearic Islands in Spain. The boys were always happy to go to a beach, and if there were other children, Guy would very quickly make friends. We would chat with the parents. We'd been with a particular family one day and agreed to meet up again. They were coming to the end of their holiday. The next morning we went back and one of their friends was complaining of dreadful toothache. A filling had fallen out and the pain was dreadful. The hotel had not been helpful concerning a dentist, and all she had was paracetamol. It wasn't helping. Max mentioned that we had filler on board and maybe we could help. I was furious. It's one thing doing a temporary filling for yourself or family, something totally different, fiddling about with someone else's teeth. But Jane was desperate, and soon we were in the dinghy heading for Matusa-Donna. According to Max, the really good thing about dentistry tools is that they reach the places that other tools can't. He had discovered that if he dropped something in the black hole of the engine, he could pick it out more easily with the help of the dentist tweezers. As a result, the tools were not in the most hygienic state. I started boiling water to sterilise them, but on a small gas burner this takes time and the poor woman wasn't prepared to wait. "For goodness sake, just do it with your fingers," she said. And so I did. It was much easier. I managed to get glue and filler into the relevant place, and Jane kept her mouth open long enough for it to dry and stick. Her reaction was instant. Agony had reduced to painful but bearable. I was very pleased for her. I delivered her back to the beach, and she insisted on taking our address. Some months later, we received a packet of letters from my parents, who were acting as letterbox for us. Jane had sent me a postcard saying that the filling had stayed in place for the 3 days required to get back to England and to get an appointment with her dentist. I gave Max merry hell about using medicine tools that we might need for emergencies, but sure enough, the next time he dropped something into the engine, out came the tweezers. They really were the only thing that could reach. I just gave up. In the first year of our trip, we spent some time in Italy, and especially in the Bay of Naples. Max's parents came out to see us and stayed at the Exceedi Hotel in Vico Equense. The Italian owner arranged for us to bring Matusa-Donna into the tiny harbour so that we could spend some time with them and be close by. This was not usually allowed, but we didn't really question him when he said he'd spoken with his friends and it was fine. We stayed here for about 5 days, visiting Pompeii, and as my parents-in-law hired a car, we also went to Sorrento and a few other places just along the coast. One morning at about 4 a.m, Max and I woke up to hear a lot of noise and activity going on in the harbour. We went on deck, and to our astonishment, the powerboat next to Metusa Donna had sunk on her moorings. We were surrounded by a police launch, the customs boat, and a lot of people who were doing a lot of gesticulating and shouting. We decided we'd be better off keeping out of it, and we went back to bed. Later, we discovered that the powerboat belonged to someone who'd upset the local mafia. We started to realise who the hotel owner's friends were. If the north of Italy is fairly well off with its industry and tourist areas, the south is the opposite. There was dreadful poverty, and we found ourselves seeking shelter in marinas that were never finished despite being well marked on the chart. This was one of them. One day, Max had an infected foot, and I knew I wouldn't be able to sort it out, so we took advice and started walking to the nearby hospital. Suffice to say that it was in a shocking state. The waiting room was filthy, and we nearly turned and left, but the doctor arrived and ushered us into a slightly cleaner-looking room. He spoke a bit of English and reassured us that everything would be fine. We stayed, and he dealt with the infection with me watching his every move and checking that everything he used came out of a clean, unopened packet. All was well. As we made our way back to the boat, still on foot, a car suddenly pulled up next to us. The driver offered to take us back to the marina, and as the boys were struggling, we accepted. He really couldn't have been kinder, and once there, he insisted that we come for supper with his family that evening. He'd collect us. We accepted, perhaps rather naively. The evening came, and sure enough, he arrived at the boat and took us up into the hills to his house. Here we met his wife and his son. We didn't speak much Italian, but with the help of a dictionary, we managed to muddle through in a mixture of Italian and English. Supper was simple but delicious. Pasta, obviously. After a while, Hugh fell asleep on the sofa and Guy sat reading his book. A little later, Guy got bored. As it happened, Guy, at the age of 4, did speak Italian. He'd spent 4 months in an Italian school and spoke whichever language felt right. Our host saw that Guy was bored and in Italian told him to just go over to that cupboard and you'll find some toys. Guy did as he was told. When he opened the cupboard, it held just one item, a handgun. I froze, but I did realise that panicking would be a disaster. Guy picked up the gun and, thank God, gave it to Max, and he did whatever you do to guns to make them safe. Disaster was averted, but a pleasant evening had suddenly turned extremely awkward. Soon afterwards, Max and I started to make our excuses and explained that the boys were very tired and we needed to get back to the boat. To be honest, we just wanted to leave. It wasn't a problem, our host would take us straight away. Just as we thought the strange events of the evening were coming to an end, they got stranger. About 200 metres short of the marina, our host stopped the car and explained that he'd rather we get out there as it would be easier for him to turn around. This was rubbish, but frankly we were happy to say our goodbyes. After the gun, we'd been struggling. We walked slowly back to the marina carrying the children in our arms, and there we found the place swarming with police. A body had been found floating in the water. The next day we left early and started to head east towards Greece. It cannot be denied that we were living in cramped quarters. However, we really didn't think of it as that. For us, we had everything we needed within easy reach. Because a boat moves around and tilts, everything has to be put away, and as a result, we always knew where things were. The boys got used to Lego and trains being put away at night, and Hugh had a little area by his bed where he could keep a couple of toy cars to play with in his bunk. Other easy access shelves had books, lots of books. Apart from the books we used for navigation, we all read a huge amount. Max was always well informed about the history of places we visited. I was a novel freak, and the boys had endless books from Where's Wally, Richard Scarry, and later on the entire set of C.S. Lewis Narnia books. Other liveaboards were astonished that we had a wooden train set on board, but it really was fantastic. And quickly we discovered that children from other boats would visit us and play happily with Guy and Hugh, setting up ever more complicated railway designs. If the cabin was our living room, the deck was the gym. At anchor, Hugh and Guy would use the rigging as a jungle gym and clamber up and sit on the mainsail. At sea, they'd play the monkey game, which involved climbing around the inside of the boat without touching the floor. They had to swing from grab handles and help each other climb over what they called the alligator pits. If we were sailing into the wind and the boat was leaning over, they'd turn the cabin table into a slide, landing on the cushioned seat the other side. After lunch each day, the boys would usually play in the cabin where it was cooler. They often built a den using the cushions from the seats, and Guy would read Hugh a story. Lots of giggling could be heard. The imagination of the children is infinite. The longest single voyage of our trip was the Atlantic. We arrived in Gibraltar in October and spent a couple of weeks getting the boat ready for the trip. Gibraltar is a good place to stock up with long-term stores, tins of food, charts for Max, books and crayons for the boys. The list was endless. We met lots of other people doing the same thing, and as the date to leave Gibraltar grew closer, we all became a little bit more manic about lists of jobs that should be done. Well, the ones that had to be done. Well, maybe these ones will be done if we have time, and actually these don't need to be on the list at all. Well, somehow we got everything done and set sail for the Canary Islands. In Gran Canaria, we met up with about 100 other boats who, like us, were taking part in the Atlantic Rally for cruisers. It was an opportunity to talk with like-minded people, share ideas, get advice, and for the boys to make friends. If I'd filled the boat with tins of food in Gibraltar, now is the time to fill the remaining space with fresh food. But what keeps? Well, bananas are pretty good. Unfortunately, they all turn yellow and then black at the same time, but they kept us going for about 2 weeks. Onions and garlic last for 1 week, and then they decide humidity is too much. Tomatoes were good, avocados were excellent, potatoes weren't bad. We bought a lot of oranges and wrapped them in aluminium foil, and that kept them fresh all the way across. Everything had to be washed before it was taken on board. Cockroaches are the dread of every boat, and their favourite hiding place was cardboard, so all of the boxes were removed on the dock. As the big day grew near, we borrowed some paint and brushes and left our mark on the wall of the harbour. This is a pre-transatlantic tradition, and the wall was covered in paintings. The following year, they'd be covered up by a new lot of voyages. Here you can see Max did the central picture in the middle, and then Guy and Hugh each did their own pictures. A number of families took part in the rally, and the day before we left, the children received gifts from the town and the organisers. This was a really nice touch. The organisers only knew the names and ages of the children, but they went to a lot of trouble to fit the gift to the child. We decided that for such a long trip, we should have an additional adult on board, and a friend of a friend turned up. Charles was a first-class sailor, but he wasn't quite so good with children. However, by the end of the trip, he decided that the boys were actually okay if you read stories and played games all the time, and didn't object too often to being part of the obstacle course around the cabin. By now, the boys were 3 and 5 years old. Guy loved sailing and was able to steer a course, and he also began to understand the significance of the marks that Max was putting on the charts. These were the days before computer charts. In fact, there were no computers really at all on boats. There was GPS on some boats, but not ours, and we were using a satellite navigation system that gave us a more or less accurate position, more or less every few hours, if we were lucky. We carried a sextant, although thankfully we never had to use it in earnest. Obviously we were crossing time zones, so meals were taken as and when. As we were heading west and the wind was behind us, we decided we'd eat lunch once the sail was shading us from the sun. This seemed to work quite well, and the rest of the day was organised accordingly. After lunch, we'd put the paddling pool filled with seawater in the cockpit, and the boys would have fun splashing around and keeping cool. We watched the stars in the evening and pointed out the easy ones. It was a time of year when there were masses of shooting stars, and we would count these in the evening with the boys. One night, I was on watch alone, and the sky was suddenly lit up with a bright green light that lasted a few seconds. It was the most beautiful meteorite. It was such a shame that I was the only one to have seen it. But truly, the beauty of nature was all around us. Phosphorescence on some nights was extraordinary. One evening, we were joined by a group of dolphins who spent some time playing in the bow wave. They were lit up by the phosphorescence, and they looked like torpedoes as they swam towards the boat. Approximately every 4 days, we'd catch a fish in the early morning. This was wonderful for a couple of reasons. Obviously, it meant fresh fish for breakfast or lunch, but it also meant we could keep the boys occupied as they helped us clean the fish and then the deck, as they weighed it, measured it, drew a picture in the logbook together with the name of the type of fish. If we caught a fish, it was a major opportunity. It was a major entertainment opportunity. Sometimes things got broken. Max was meticulous about maintenance. He checked the rigging every morning and again in the evening if we were sailing, and the motor was given regular servicing. I was in charge of the sails, and if the smallest hole appeared, it was patched before it could get worse. The children's toys were more complicated. Hugh had a collection of very precious toy cars. He knew every single one by colour, and as time went by, he knew the different dents that appeared on each one. He also knew exactly who held the title of ship's mechanic. And he also decided that Max's chart table, upon which nothing could be placed unless it was a chart, was the garage that could fix anything. Max would come down to his chart table and find messages and broken cars which had to be fixed. Right now, not in a minute, Daddy, now. Eventually, Guy, prompted by Max, realised that there was probably only one more sleep before we arrived in St. Lucia. Great excitement. Sure enough, the next day we saw land for the first time in 23 days. The problem with sighting land at 9 a.m. is that it takes all day to actually get to it. But we finally arrived at Rodney Bay in St. Lucia around 4 p.m. Other ARC boats who we'd met in Gran Canaria were waiting for us, and it was an emotional time. Of course, we all wanted to get on shore and stretch our legs, but after so long at sea, we wobbled, and poor Hugh fell flat on his face, unharmed but very confused that the land under his feet was no longer moving. The Bahamas are all extremely lie-lowing, so when there's a hill, it's a major event. And leaving a visiting card was another tradition that we happily took part in. We'd write the name of the boat on a piece of driftwood, the boys would draw a picture, and we'd leave it on a pile at the top of the hill. One of these hills was in Wardrick Wells. Almost everyone we met who had spent some time sailing in the Bahamas told us to visit Wardrick Wells. It was a nature park and very protected. A limited number of boats are allowed to anchor at any one time, but we were there towards the end of the season and it really wasn't a problem. The anchorage has good shelter and we found ourselves with 3 or 4 other boats. Once the anchor was down and the sails put away, Max would always take his mask and snorkel and swim over the anchor to check it was well dug in and not caught on anything. Depending on the time of day, he'd then spend a bit of time snorkeling around. Wardrick Wells is very strict. Take nothing but memories, leave nothing but footprints. It's packed with seabirds, giant iguanas, and the water is teeming with fish. The white beaches had beautiful seashells, but there was no fishing, seashells were not allowed to be taken, and obviously absolutely nothing could be thrown overboard. We'd arrived in the late afternoon, and Max had read that there was a wreck in the bay. After checking the anchor, he swam off to find it, and sure enough, it wasn't far from Donna. The water wasn't deep, so he dived down to take a closer look. As he came up again, he noticed the water was changing colour. As he broke the surface, he looked up and saw 4 people staring at him in total horror from the back of a boat. They were friends of the owner of the wreck, and he'd asked that when he died, they put his ashes in the water in Wardwick Wells. Of course, they were breaking all the rules, but ashes are organic, and they wouldn't stay for long, and the friends wanted to honour his wishes. They decided to do it in the evening so they could drink a toast to their friend. And here was Max, surfacing like a ghost back to haunt them. We spent the next day exploring the island. It wasn't big, but there were beaches for the boys to explore and lots of snorkelling to be done. Hugh finally learnt to snorkel in the Bahamas. He still couldn't quite swim, but he'd come with us wearing a life jacket, a marvel at the world underneath. Swimming over reefs, we would see brightly coloured angelfish, eels, and beautiful coral. The giant iguanas were very friendly, but they had a slightly scary habit of running towards you en masse, much to Hugh's surprise. In actual fact, they always stopped at a respectful distance, but they were big, and there were lots of them. In March 1993, we were in the Bahamas and slowly on our way to America. The boys were growing up, and we'd told our families that we'd be heading home soon. The Bahamas are very low-lying, and storms sweep over them, which meant we always chose our anchorages carefully. Throughout the trip, safety had been a priority. It is on all boats, but with young children on board, we took no additional risks. With our friends Mike and Karen and their 3 daughters on the boat Pennywhistle, we arrived mid-morning in the Berry Islands after a long sail of about 36 hours. Max and I were tired from the trip, but of course the boys were full of energy. After all, they'd been asleep all night. A trip to the beach, lunch and a siesta was in order. We listened to the weather forecast every day. If it was broadcast 3 times, we listened 3 times. The weather can change quickly and very dramatically. At lunchtime that day, the forecast was for settled weather, and as it was a Thursday, the weather reader even finished off with "Have a nice weekend, everyone." But if there was a possibility to listen to another forecast, Max always did. He couldn't resist it. That day, he tuned in to the military base in Norfolk, Virginia, and their forecast was dramatically different. There was a very deep depression heading our way, and it was due to hit the Bahamas on Friday. The seriousness of our situation was immediate. They described the depression as comparable to a hurricane, but as it was March, officially it couldn't be called that. Max immediately went over to Pennywhistle to discuss the options with Mike and Karen. The nearest 360-degree shelter was in Grand Bahama, which was 12 hours away, and where the entrance was protected by a reef. Looking at the chart, we had to cross the reef 15 minutes either side of high tide. High tide was 10 a.m. We were sitting in a bay with flat, calm water, not a breath of wind and not a cloud in the sky. The whole thing was unbelievable, except that it was real. On boats, you look out for each other, and on the basis that it was pure chance he'd heard the warning, Max then went to each of the other boats in the bay and gave them the news. Then what they did with it was up to them. One boat, Charlie's Crab, with 2 couples on board, said they'd head back to Florida. Our siesta was cut short, and by 6 p.m. we were off again. The boys were disappointed, but as most of the trip would be overnight, they soon settled down and were in bed. We left the Berry Islands under motor, with still not a breath of wind. Pennywhistle was with us, but some of the other boats were going to ride it out. At 2 a.m, I took over from Max. We were still under motor with just the mainsail up to stabilise the boat. I could feel a gentle breeze, and at about 3 a.m. I was considering putting up the jib. Then suddenly and without warning, the motor stopped. Max was out of the cabin in seconds with a "What's going on?" He had a look at the back of the boat, and it seemed we'd hit a tarpaulin, which was now wrapped around the propeller. There was nothing we could do until daybreak. We put up the jib and radioed Pennywhistle to explain what had happened. There was no question of us getting into Grand Bahama without the motor, and to say we were worried is an understatement. Gradually, the wind blew stronger, and by 6 a.m. we were sailing along quite nicely. The waves were getting bigger, and as soon as we could see enough, Max had to try to remove the tarpaulin. At 6:30 a.m. we radioed Pennywhistle, who'd agreed to stand by to help if necessary. The sea by this time was decidedly rough, and the boat was bashing up and down quite alarmingly. The boys had woken up and were strapped into the cockpit where they sat sleepily. Max tied a rope around his waist, and with a mask and snorkel and a knife, he went into the water. It took 40 minutes. The propeller is about 4 feet under the water, and Max had to keep coming up for air. In addition, he had to keep his left hand on the bottom of the boat so that as it went up and down, he could avoid being hit on the head. With just his right hand, he was cutting away at the tarpaulin. Finally, he came back on board, and mercifully, the engine started without a problem. We radioed Pennywhistle and thanked them for standing by. It could not have been very comfortable for them either. Of course, for the next couple of hours, we didn't need the motor. The wind by now was very strong, and we had 2 reefs in the mainsail, but we were still making good time. Max was exhausted, but had to stay on watch as we approached Grand Bahama. Pennywhistle, a smaller and slightly slower boat, were behind us. They had a GPS. We didn't. At exactly 9:45, we arrived in front of the reef and were confident we'd find our way into the channel in time. But we couldn't find the entrance. There was no question of someone going up the mast. It was too rough. Pennywhistle was still looking out for us. They called us urgently to wait. They were very worried that we were going to try and go ahead anyway. But they had a GPS and they'd lead us in. We waited. It was a long wait. Pennywhistle slower than us, and as the clock ticked past 10 a.m, we were both getting anxious. But with minutes to spare, they were with us, and with the help of their GPS, guided us through the reef. Instantly, the water was calm. The man-made channel doglegs its way into a large basin within the island. We'd made it, but with no time to spare. In the Bahamas and other places, we regularly put out 2 anchors. This time, we put out 3. The wind got stronger and almost certainly reached gale 10 or more, but we were well protected. The boat was knocked on her side a few times, but we kept the boys down in the cabin and just tried to keep busy. We kept in touch with Pennywhistle via the radio, and they, like us, were down in the cabin riding out the storm. We also kept the radio tuned to Channel 16, the emergency channel, and it was here that we discovered how very fortunate we'd been. Many, many boats were lost during that storm. One of the boats in particular made the national news because the owner, Chuck Muir, had a string of restaurants along the east coast, which I think were called Red Lobster. The boat was Charlie's Crab, who Max had warned back in the Berry Islands. They'd put out an emergency call twice, but then nothing was heard. Neither their bodies nor their boat were ever found. After 3 days, we were finally able to put the dinghy in the water and go ashore. We all needed to stretch our legs on land that wasn't moving around wildly, and we wanted to call our families and tell them we were safe. The damage caused by the storm was extraordinary. Some areas were untouched, others completely ruined. The hotel swimming pool was full of sand. This storm became known as the storm with no name, or the storm of the century. We had been extraordinarily fortunate to escape without damage, or worse. It never ceased to amaze me the instinct that Max had for the sea, and in particular for the weather. He could read clouds and to a lesser extent waves. If he told me to put a reef in the sail, I never questioned his judgment. We could be sailing along with no wind, But minutes after reducing the sail, the wind would get up and things would start to get interesting. I don't know how he does it, nor does he. He just does. Sailing up the intercoastal waterway, the water only really got rough when big powerboats went past. It was well protected from the Atlantic, and even if the wind was blowing hard, the water would be calm. On the 4th of July, we anchored off St. Augustine in Florida. We'd heard that there would be fireworks, and we planned to watch them from the boat. There were many boats anchored in the waterway. Most of the owners were going ashore for the fireworks. At about 10 p.m, just before the display was due to start, Max and I were playing backgammon in the cockpit. It was a balmy evening with not a breath of wind. Suddenly, Max told me to put away the backgammon and turn the batteries on. This meant he wanted to start the engine. Alarmed, I did as I was told, but without any understanding of what he had in mind. When I came back on deck, he told me to go up to the anchor and let out more chain and then stand by. Letting out more anchor chain meant that the boat had more weight at the front and would not swing around quite so much. I did as I was told, but it still made no sense. Suddenly, and without any warning, a tornado came through. Max was running the engine hard to keep the boat from pulling backwards and lifting the anchor. All around us, boats were on the move. The force of the wind had pulled them back in the water and pulled their anchors out of the seabed. They were coming down towards us fast, often with no one on board. I spent the next 20 minutes pushing boats away from Matusadonna. I couldn't do anything to help them, but the risk was that they would crash into us or that their anchors would catch our chain, and then we too would be off down the river. As quickly as it had started, the wind stopped. Max switched off the engine, but we stayed on deck as boats were still drifting towards us. After the fireworks, people started coming back to the anchorage. They knew nothing about the tornado and were alarmed to find their boats were not where they'd left them. I asked Max how he knew. He couldn't explain it except to say that he'd felt a drop in the air pressure. It was just instinct, coupled with knowledge of how weather works and always wanting to have as much information about it as possible. This was something I was always grateful for. The intercoastal waterway took us all the way up the east coast. We saw manatees for the first time and enjoyed the bird life. We stopped in Titusville and visited NASA, and during this time we were fortunate to see 2 shuttle launches, one at night. We were just 3 miles from the launch pad, and it really was spectacular. Further up the waterway, people would see us at anchor and invite us ashore for a meal in the evening. Everyone was always very kind, as well as curious about our lifestyle. We discovered many museums, and some of them would lend a car to liveaboards such as us, so that we could explore a little further afield. The kindness of strangers was everywhere. We very much wanted to sail up the Potomac, and the opportunity came in late September, which was perfect, as it would coincide with the fall, about which I'd heard so much from my mother, who'd spent her childhood in America. It's a long river, and it took us 2 days from Chesapeake Bay to reach the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, which carries the I-95 and the I-495 over the river. You could say it's a busy bridge. In those days, it was taking about 200,000 cars across it every day. Since we were there, the bridge has been rebuilt, and it's now 20 feet higher. But back in 1993, the bridge was about 6 feet too low for our mast, and we therefore had to ask for the bridge to be raised so we could pass through. The bridge could be opened twice a day. We called the authorities to make the necessary arrangements and were told we'd be going through at 10 a.m. the following morning. We spent the night at anchor at the foot of the bridge and listened to the traffic passing by. The next morning we were called on the radio and confirmed our presence, and at 9:45 a.m. the alarms were ringing and the lights flashing to alert the traffic that the bridge was closing. The barriers came down, the cars stopped. The bridge was raised just enough for us to pass through, a very small sailing boat proudly flying our British ensign. I hate to think what the people in the cars were thinking. By 10:15 they were off again, but we worked out that we'd caused disruption to about 10,000 cars and a traffic jam of anything up to 3 miles in each direction. On the way back down the river, we had to do the same thing, but there was a cargo ship going through at the same time, so we felt a little less guilty. After 3 years afloat, it was time to head home. The boys were growing up fast and needed more structure in their young lives. We'd experienced the most wonderful things, but it was time to stop. The North Atlantic can be very rough, and we decided that I would fly home with the boys and Max would sail back and meet us in France. We said our goodbyes in North Carolina. There were no satellite communications in those days, and it would be at least 5 or 6 weeks before I heard from him again. He arrived in St. Malo in mid-June, safe and sound. I drove up to meet him with the boys. It was very strange. We'd spent 6 weeks living with my sister in a house with a garden and with lots of space. Suddenly we were back on a small boat. But it was wonderful to be all together again, and the boys soon got back into their old routine. Since 1993 we've lived in Anjou. We live in a 14th century house surrounded by a moat. Not quite the sea, but still. We sold Metusa Donna in 2007. The boys are now grown up. Guy lives in Vancouver with his wife and his newly born daughter, and he sails his own boat. He's a skilled tactician and is often called upon for racing. Hugh lives in London. He's always been an adventurer and as a student, earned his living teaching snowboarding and windsurfing. Their younger brother Rafe was born soon after we arrived in France. He also lives in London and works with his brothers, but he also has a keen affection for water and is a very skilled diver. That's the end. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's given me enormous pleasure looking back over a period of our lives which was so happy and so varied and so exciting. If you have any questions, you can send me an email or I guess post a comment and I'll do my best to answer. Thank you.